Welcome to Nightmare Nate's Nighttime Showcase.
When it comes to the discussion of survival horror, some of the community seems locked up on the definition. Basically, there are two opposing sides who have differing opinions on what survival horror is. And before we get into it, I do want to make clear that I do see both sides of the argument, and I do respect them. The first definition that part of the community agrees with is a horror-themed game with resource management and static camera angles. Some in this camp even go as far as to say that tank controls must be part of the equation. The people that champion this definition of survival horror are usually old fans of the genre. The other part of the community believes that a survival horror game is just a horror-themed game with survival mechanics. No fixed camera angles and no tank controls required. Now, to be honest, I personally fall under this camp, though I do believe that some people who fall under this camp can be a little too lax and lenient on this definition. For example, I've seen people label games like Resident Evil 5, or Silent Hill The Short Message, or Outlast Survival Horror, and I believe that's being too lenient. On the contrary, people who fall under the hardcore, former old-school definition wouldn't even classify games like Resident Evil 7 or the new upcoming Silent Hill 2 remake as survival horror, which I would disagree heavily with. So, since I have issues with both of them, what's my definition? My definition of survival horror is a horror game with a focus on resource management being used as a means to cause fear and tension with the player. A survival horror game is one where you're scared to engage enemies for the fear of not having enough ammo or healing items to make it through later on. It's a game where exploring feels dangerous because you don't know what you'll encounter and what you'll have to expend. Where backtracking is placed in a way that makes you dread not exploring and completing areas efficiently. I believe that my definition makes the most sense with the actual naming convention of survival horror. I feel like my definition of survival horror explains the feelings and goals honestly that the name implies. The genre is not called Bird's Eye Tank Control Resource Management or Hide and Run Simulator. Now, like I said earlier, I can understand where the old school fans are coming from. They want things and only see things as survival horror if they're completely in line with the progenitor of the term. They feel as if those mechanics like the static camera angles are crucial to the experience and feelings, which I respectfully reject. In my opinion, and the somewhat opinion of Shinji Mikami, these older games were not created 100% like this, out of artistic decision. You see, the fixed camera angles were actually intentional. It just so happens that to have fixed camera angles like that work, you unfortunately have to compromise the controls. Now, some of the older survival horror games did actually implement normal movement with the static camera angles, but there's a problem with that too. And since Nitro Rat explains it better than I ever could, I'll let him explain it.
Though unlike Eternal Darkness, this game's camera still has those sudden cuts, which is something that can cause problems with control. When you're holding one direction and the camera angle changes, that direction you're holding suddenly means something different. And as per usual, this is mostly solved by having your character continuing to run in the prior direction despite the new angle, which gives you a moment to move the stick to a fresh direction without the character walking the wrong way.
So, with those problems highlighted, I think it's clear that the survival horror genre has room to grow. To be clear, this is coming from somebody who grew up with the originals. Even though I'm one of those darn Gen Zers, I grew up poor, so I was always 2 gens behind when it came to the consoles I had access to. Thrift stores and flea markets were my best friend. The first horror game I was ever exposed to was the original Resident Evil, and I fucking love it to this day. I love the old style, as well as the newer third-person, and my personal favorite, first-person survival horror. I think both styles lend themselves to the format of survival horror really, really well in their own ways. The old-style survival horror games are valid and can present unique horror experiences that the modern format just can't, even though some of it was not intentional. I'm sure you guys have heard of this one before if you're a part of the scene, but it's a good example. There used to be this prevalent misconception that the tank controls in the old style games were intentionally designed in order to make movement feel difficult and clunky, and this clunkiness was for the express purpose of increasing the tension in combat. You'd run into an enemy, and because of the sudden shock and unintuitive controls, you freak out and misinput your movement, which led to more horrifying encounters. Now, this experience is actually true about the older games, and it's one of the reasons that I still value them. I hate to say it, but the tank controls that work so well with survival horror is nothing more than a happy accident. Now, let's talk about the intentional mechanic. The static camera angles lend themselves to horror quite well. I'm personally very fond of comparing it to manga panels in a way. Think of Junji Ito and how he sets up scares. He preps you from one page to the next, in anticipation of what lies on the next page. The old school survival horror games basically do the same thing, and it's a very cool and unique way of scaring the player, which I really enjoy. Particularly, I love that tension of hearing an enemy in the same room as you and not being able to see where they are because the camera angle obscures them. In the moment, it makes you want to push your analog stick in the vain hope that it'll move your camera. In horror, most times the thought is worse than actually being presented with it. As you can tell, I really appreciate this style of survival horror, but I also prefer the modern style, because they also have aspects that only they're able to utilize to the potential of horror that the original style doesn't have. To be clear, I'll be talking about first and third person in unison, because what I'll be talking about pretty much applies to both styles. For brevity, we'll refer to it as modern. First, let's talk about my favorite part of the modern survival horror experience: aiming. Obviously, an advantage the modern style has is the more interesting and engaging combat, and the act of actually having to aim and land shots on enemies enhances the fear and tension in combat. Gone are the days of holding R1 and pressing X. The original style games did have the advantage of tank controls as a means of creating tension, but in my opinion, the aiming in the new style blows it out of the water. In the old games, there was never that tension of wasting ammo because of your own mistakes. Your shot always lands. Now, I know some games you could turn off auto-lock, or like in the newer horror games made in the old style, like Alissa. There's no auto-lock for the purpose of integrating that kind of tension into the older games. But even then, it's nothing like 3D omnidirectional aiming, especially the games that do it right. In non-horror FPS games, you want aiming to be precise, but in a good horror game, you want your reticle to sway and be hard to control so that the player doesn't feel confident in encounters. They want you to feel disempowered. There's nothing more teeth-gritting than missing a headshot and seeing the enemy get closer, as well as the stress of knowing that you just wasted resources. There is no such dynamic like that in the older games. I want to feel endangered in combat, and for me, the original games kind of struggle to do that for me. Another aspect the modern style has due to its perspective is how you disengage from enemies. With the modern style, you have to run away from encounters with the direction your camera's facing, which means when you run away from something like a Jack Baker, you have to turn your back to him to escape. The unease of choosing to run away and not knowing the exact position of the enemy or how close you are to getting chainsawed is thrilling. Don't get it confused. I'm not saying that the original games don't have a feeling of immersion, but I do believe that the first or third person's perspective lends itself more to it. Actually seeing the world closer up and through the perspective of the player makes the horror feel more personal, which allows you to connect more with the situations that you're thrown into. I also find that the perspective also strengthens the horror by making you feel more claustrophobic, because you're only ever able to see what's around you or in front of you, which I find to be really effective. To wrap this up, I also love the aspect of being able to use your free camera to find the game's terrifying events yourself. Like in the RE2 remake, where you walk into a room and don't realize there's a licker in the room until you look up. Though, to the contrary, you lose that very deliberate setup and then display that the old games do so well. I hope my opinion helps clarify what survival horror should be, and hopefully the community can agree that both styles are valid in the format. At the very least, I hope you found it interesting. And now, since you've been so kind, please take it easy.